My name is Regan Miner. Good evening, all. My name is Regan Miner, and I'm the Executive Director of the Norwich Historical Society. Welcome to the program, Preserved on the Mighty Waters, Indians, Maritime Labor, and Communities of Color in Southern New England. This program is sponsored by Otis Library in partnership with the Norwich Historical Society. So just some housekeeping before we get started. Please make sure your microphone is muted. We will be recording this lecture, so please adjust your video accordingly. We will be taking some questions at the end, but please place your questions in the chat and we will queue them up for our speaker at the end of the program. Before we get started with this evening's program, I'd like to read the Norwich Historical Society's land acknowledgement statement. In the spirit of truth and equity, it is with gratitude and humility that we pay tribute to the Mohegan tribe, the original stewards of the land where the city of Norwich now stands. Norwich can trace its origins to the year 1659, when Chief Uncas gave a gift of 9 miles square of his native homeland to the immigrant people surrounding him. The Norwich Historical Society recognized the town's debt to that landmark event of centuries ago and acknowledges the encroachments resulted in the eventual disposition of the tribe's land. The descendants of Uncas continue to live and work beside us in the present and will be among us in the generations that follow. We now work toward greater awareness of the inequities of history, most especially the destruction of the tribe's burying grounds, which resulted in the establishment of Memorial Grove dedicated in 2008. As we move forward to the future, let us not forget the past so that we can build an inclusive and equitable location for all those who come to occupy what was once solely native land. Thank you. So this talk this evening will focus on the hundreds of Indians and other men of color who found work in maritime labor. Our speaker will highlight the Customs District of New London and explore the global social networks they formed, their traveling histories, and the objects they collected and the stories they told. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our esteemed speaker this evening, Dr. Jason Mancini. Dr. Jason Mancini joined Connecticut Humanities as Executive Director in 2018. He is also co-founder of Agamont Educational Initiative and former Executive Director of the Mashantucket Museum and Research Center. Currently, the Mellon Visiting Fellow in Slavery and Justice at Brown University, Dr. Mancini previously served as Adjunct Professor of Anthropology at the University of Connecticut, Visiting Assistant Professor of Anthropology at Connecticut College, Visiting Assistant Professor of History at Brown University, and Social Sciences Instructor at C for Sea Education Association. Please welcome Dr. Mancini. Take it away, Jason. Thank you for being here this evening.
Thanks, Regan. It's great to be here. It's great to see all of you. And I'm sorry about the subtitle change. I play around with these a little bit, but the focus is really on the communities of color and the intersections of Indian country in Southern New England and beyond. And this is really a reflection of the culmination of 30 years of work with the tribal communities in Southern New England and the sort of range of experiences I've had, both working with the tribal communities, but then traveling to these other places around the world to pursue their stories and to really begin looking at those intersections with other communities and cultures around the world. What I'd like to do is begin by just recentering us on Southern New England. And in order to do so, I think it's important that we set up a couple of ground rules, if you will, in terms of how I think about the work that I've done. And really this is in my deep work in the archival archives of Southern New England. What I realized was there's an enormous gap in the story of Southern New England tribal communities. And really what I found was we need to begin thinking about different ways of connecting the 17th century Indian wars, which are most prominently known, the Pequot War, of course, that took place in Mystic and across Southern New England, but also King Philip's War towards the end of the 17th century. And then connecting that time period with the 20th century casinos towards the end of the 20th century anyway, where people, the white public really had no sense or understanding of where these people came from and why are they coming out of the woodwork. And And so beginning to fill in those gaps with a deeper understanding of the story of Southern New England through the process of dispossession and documentary erasure and the compartmentalization of Indian histories within multiple kinds of record groups. And that really became the source material for bringing back the narratives that I'll share with you tonight. And throughout it all, keeping in mind the sort of key threads that bind the communities, Indian communities and the broader community of color across this region. And that is a connection to homeland, a particular identity around being indigenous, specifically Mohegan or Pequot or Narragansett or Wampanoag, and then the kinship networks that really bind all of those communities together in particular places and with particular cultural connections.
What is this?
And you'll see this rootedness throughout. If I can orient all of you to this map of Southern New England, and we really have to think about this as Indian country and erase in our minds these dark lines that now are constructed around state geopolitical boundaries. These lines didn't exist prior to the arrival of Europeans. What did exist were the various geographies, the rivers, the hills, the mountains, and so on. But if we think about where we're at now, where I'm calling in from are the Pequot homelands in North Stonington. And I'm just going to sort of take you on an ethnogeography of Southern New England. So the Pequot homelands in Mashantucket and Lantern Hill, the communities here, across the Thames River at Mohegan, in Lyme or East Lyme today, the Western Niantic or Niantic, along the Connecticut River in Middletown, the Wangunk, and in Farmington, the Tunxus, in New Haven area, the Quinnipiac, in southwestern Connecticut, and particularly Bridgeport area, the Gussets, up the Housatonic River, the Putatuck, Weantanock, and Scatacoke. The Scatacoke are currently a state-recognized tribal community today. Up in western Massachusetts, the Stockbridge Mohican. In central Massachusetts, the Nipmuc. In eastern Massachusetts, the Wampanoags. In Rhode Island, actually the Wampanoags have homelands in eastern Rhode Island, but in Rhode Island proper and southern Rhode Island are the Narragansett and eastern Niantic. And for the purposes of this conversation, I think it's really important to begin thinking about Southern New England as extended to the geography of Long Island. So I often include Montauk, the Shinnecock, and the Unkachog at the Poospatuck Reservation in central Long Island. And part of that is really the deep ways in which water serves as a connector rather than a divider. And as I pointed out here, this area of Indian country constitutes about 9 million acres of land. And by the American Revolution, most of that land evaporated, actually almost all of it, with the exception of about 30,000 acres for all of those tribal communities to live on. And the work that I'm engaged in is really looking at the ways that Indian people had to re-navigate and learn about an entirely different world in this settler colonial society and how exactly they're going to survive without their land, their homelands, the traditional economies that they participated in, and how do they stay connected. So that's really the roadmap I want to lay out for you tonight. And in doing so, what I want to get rid of this bar. What I'd like to talk a little bit about are some of the complicating factors in that process of dispossession, the loss of land. There are, as part of that dispossession, what we see are the very active acquisition of indigenous homelands and the transformation of the ecology of Southern New England. So you can see here in the upper left-hand image, what's going on across Southern New England in the 18th century. And this is formerly forests and some cornfields that are now being cut down, divided, and allocated as private property versus shared communal resources. And then fences, picket fences initially, and then certainly the stone walls we have and recognize as part of our cultural landscape today emerged from this. And this was a radical transformation in southern New England. 90% or more of these lands were transformed from forest to fields and pastures. And this was devastating to a traditional indigenous economy that was principally rooted in herding deer, capturing turkey, and other woodland mammals. But certainly this affected the waterways, the fishing rights, and so on. There are accounts in southern Connecticut of Pequots having to go into Massachusetts, and Niantics having to go into northwestern Connecticut just to find deer to hunt. And these resources were so important and yet utterly absent, which forced a radical transformation of indigenous economies away from their subsistence economy and towards a market economy where they had to sell their labor. And speaking of labor, there are two pieces here. Certainly the enslavement of Africans and bringing them into indigenous homelands here began to transform the landscape of southern New England in the labor economy. Unfree labor was significant. It was systematic across the state, and I'll show you some images about the impact across Connecticut. But this also brought to bear, for the first time in human history, human beings from 4 continents coming together and interacting socially and sexually. And the mixed descendants of those people are now part of this, this colonial system. And the white power keepers in all of this are really beginning to articulate a new understanding of race, power, and citizenship with respect to that. And I want to come back to that slide in a minute, but I do want to mention this bottom left side is an image of a Mohican warrior during the American Revolution. And this is really just to call out the significant participation of indigenous men in colonial conflicts. And we have this, we see this not just in the early Indian wars, if you will, Indian-European wars, but in every colonial encounter since. So from Queen Anne's War to King William's War to King George's War to the French and Indian War to the American Revolution, across the 18th century, we have indigenous men participating in disproportionately large numbers. 50 to 75% of their populations are serving in these conflicts. And half to 3/4 of those men never come home. And this is conflict after conflict after conflict. And so we start to see different ways in which Indian communities are adjusting. In part, Indian children and women are falling into poverty, into terrible circumstances in the absence of men. But we're also starting to see, again, that intersection of different peoples where indigenous women and African men are coming together. And I should say that white people are in this mix as well. So we're setting up this sort of landscape of change that becomes really important for understanding everything that follows. And I'd like to just spend a couple of minutes thinking about how this is articulated, and both in terms of how indigenous people and broadly people of color are being enumerated across Connecticut, and how they're being erased in the same breath. So what I'd like to share with you here are 3 different colonial censuses in the way that indigenous people and African Americans or African people at the time are being counted across Connecticut. So I'm going to show you first the 1756 Connecticut census. So this is the colony of Connecticut. And you can see in the left-hand image, the indigenous population is being enumerated in Stonington, in Groton, and in Lyme. And this correlates with the 2 Pequot communities in the Niantic, the Western Niantic. If you recall what I said earlier in the map, the first map I showed you, I mentioned Mohegan, I mentioned Wangunk, Tungus, Quinnipiac, Pagusset, Weantanock, Scaticoke, Putatuck, and so on. They're not there. They're deliberately being left out or counted amongst the Black population in this census. And there are for the record, about 640 indigenous people being counted during this time. In the right-hand image, this is sort of the beginnings of the Black population that is being enslaved and brought into places like Newport, and then finding their ways, or well, being bought and purchased and brought onto colonial farms across Connecticut towns, and sometimes plantation-like systems. So I just want to call your attention to the time period. This is at the beginning of the French and Indian War. And if we just turn 6 years later towards the end of the French and Indian War, we can begin to see some of the transformations and the better documentation that the Indian population is experiencing here. So all of those reservation towns, if you will, are now being counted for the Indians. And now there are about 950 Indians being enumerated across Connecticut, and the Black population is growing significantly. And I mentioned earlier pauperism among women and children. This is where we really begin to see indigenous women and children being bound out as servants in white households. And we're starting to see the consequences of those wartime disruptions on communities. Indigenous people are having a hard time to feeding themselves because that environment has been transformed. Their men are either off at war, or they've been killed in the war, or died in the encampments from disease and other maladies. So we're beginning to see significant changes, so much so, and I should also mention too, this is the time period in which all these town systems across Connecticut are forming around particular parishes. Towns are developing their own economies, their own local politics, and their own systems of documentation. So that's all improving. And as a result of that, we can fast forward another dozen years just to the eve of the American Revolution and see the ways in which Connecticut's Indian population has radically been reshaped. And this is partly part of that diaspora that results from dispossession, but it's also better documentation. And now you can see Indians being enumerated in 49 Connecticut towns in a population of almost 1,400. And of course, on the right-hand image, the Black population is now ubiquitous across Connecticut. And in the midst of all of this, there are some important transformations and systematic undercounts of the Indian population because of particular factionalism, because of the inaccuracies of counting people who are moving around the landscape. And this becomes clear in some of the other work I've focused my scholarship on. But if you can, I want to come back to the census in a little while towards the end of the talk and reflect on that process of erasure. But if you can look at the ways in which this Indian population is now pushing the periphery of Connecticut, what we need to begin to imagine is that Indians are beginning to push the periphery of the land and starting to imagine their places at sea. And this is really where I began to explore some very new realities for Indigenous people in the landscape of opportunity. I want to share with you a couple of the earliest accounts that I found of Indian people in Southern New England, or in Connecticut anyway. And this is through the New London County Court records. And the image on the left is the story of George Jobe, who was on a 14-month voyage on the brigantine London in 1732 and 1733, when he left New London and traveled to Ireland, Madeira, Cape Verde, Suriname, and Boston. And I've kind of mapped that out in this crude polygon. If I were to do that again, I would probably do more of an oval or circular pattern to really reflect the circularity of ocean currents. And it's those ocean currents that become very significant in the way that people are moving around the Atlantic world and then around the globe later on. George Jobe is captured in the New London Court records because the captain of this vessel refused to pay him for his 14 months of work on the ship. And I have to imagine anybody would be upset about not being compensated for that time and labor. So George Jobe sued him and he won. And this is part of the story we never hear about Indians, is actually winning court cases. And I think, it's these historical moments when we realize that there are plenty of other possibilities and ways in which the story could have gone differently when there was justice and equity in the system. And so I just want to call attention to that as I land on Tantapanant, or Philip, who was another young Indian person on the sloop Elizabeth on a voyage just the next year, 1734-35, from Rocky Hill to Saybrook to Antigua and St. Kitts. This is a very common part of New England's economy, especially Connecticut, these Caribbean trade. Tantapanant, you notice, has an alias, and this is something that's very common among mariners. It's a way of creating an ambiguity, an anonymity at sea, if you will. And so it was frequently used, and often Indian people would have a native name and a English name. Philip managed to place himself, he is a servant or even a slave, he managed to place himself between two masters, his master on the land and his master at sea. And he made an argument to his master on the land that he could make more money for him if he allowed him to go to sea. And so the master on the land did, and he got to go to sea, and he made him a lot of money. And he produced a fight, a court fight between these two masters, in which the master at sea got to continue with his labor after that initial voyage. So it was, what I'm starting to see are the different ways that Native people are positioning themselves in this new sort of legal framework in ways that are increasingly advantageous, if unseen by the outside world. They're learning to maneuver this colonial system. And this is the sort of framework in which I want to build the narrative I'll share with you now. So there are a bunch of court cases across the 18th century, and those examples are just a couple of them. What we begin to see more and more across the 18th century are these systems of inequity. I've mentioned servitude in various forms, whether indentured or enslaved. There's also terrible situations in the military, and there are lots of accounts of desertion. And what we see captured in the region's newspapers are advertisements calling, articulating accounts of runaways, deserters, and notorious villains. And I just want to touch on that for a couple of minutes. This is a reflection of different ways that people of color, especially, are abandoning the terms of service or enslavement or some kind of unwanted situation. And these accounts in the newspapers are highly descriptive, imagining that this is in an era before there's photographs and readily made available drawings. So it's very descriptive. It often has a name, an age, a physical description of race or complexion, any particular characteristics or skills, like plays a violin, walks with a limp, has a scar or missing digit, something like that, something that will distinguish them. And I often see not just individuals, but groups, anywhere from 2 to 6 or 7 men at a time abandoning terms of service. And at the end of each one of these descriptions, there's often a warning to masters of vessels not to harbor or conceal these individuals under the strictest penalty of law. And what that tells me is that given the opportunity to escape the service, they're going to the region's ports and they're getting on vessels and they're going to sea. And that really begins to start shaping something entirely new. And if we start looking at all of the papers across southern New England during this time, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of these accounts. So this, beyond those individual legal accounts in the court records, what we now have is volume. There are a lot of people doing this. This is just an image of a couple of Wampanoag mariners much later in the 1870s, so it's slightly anachronistic, but just wanted to give you a sense of the kind of clothing a mariner might be wearing during this time. So as we move forward, through the 18th century, I became very intrigued by the number of these men that were at sea and wanted to get a sense of, are they maintaining community? How are they staying connected if they are at all? And so I started looking for various examples that might articulate that. And I came across this, this image in this story. This is the Continental Frigate Confederacy. And this is a ship that was built along the Thames River near the grounds of what is currently or formerly the Norwich State Hospital. And it was built in 1778, 1779. And I found some accounts of this, the construction of this ship in the Philadelphia Historical Society. And it turns out that there were, I should mention first that this location is directly across the river from the Mohegan Reservation. And so when I went to look at the construction records for this vessel, it turns out that there were about a dozen Mohegan men involved in the construction of this ship. And they were involved in all sorts of different ways, from carpenters to blacksmiths, but probably and most importantly, they served as the ship's riggers, which means that they were involved in all the essential engineering of the ship, all the ropes, the blocks, the tackle, the sails, all of that. And they worked in extremely dangerous positions. To me, I often think about them as the Mohawk iron workers of their day in the 18th century. Very, very dangerous, but also extremely skilled. These men were not new to the trade. They had deep experience, if not in their own careers, over generations. And so I looked at these records, and it turns out that, not only were the Mohegan men working on the vessel in these dangerous conditions, but when the vessel was completed, they also sailed on it. And they sailed on it in various positions, along with Pequots and Nipmucks and other native people. And in those different capacities, they served as not just when I first started this work, the stories that I often learned, people of color would serve as cooks and stewards. And yes, oftentimes people served in those roles, but they also served as ordinary seamen, able-bodied seamen, mates, occasionally in different vessels, captains, occasionally ship owners. What we start to see is really a meritocracy on the ocean. If you had the ability and the knowledge and the skill, you could advance yourself in various ways. Some of the men actually served as Marines on this vessel. And so that really began to open my eyes to say something different is going on here. There's a regional connection if there are Mohegans, Pequots, and Nipmucks on this vessel, and it's happening on other Revolutionary War vessels. These men are skilled and knowledgeable. What else is going on? So one of the things in the aftermath of the American Revolution, there's some important transformations in the region's economy. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the laws that are passed. But I think one of the really critical elements of this is the narrative that emerges around disappearance. If I'm screen sharing, you probably can't see this, and I don't know how to get rid of it. But this quote says, "The young men go to sea and die." There are white overseers that are now taking control of the tribal reservations in the region. And they're visiting the tribes, and they're making comments about the only people here are old women, crippled men, and children. All the able and smart men are gone, or all the young men go to sea and die. And while it's overly fatalistic to frame it that way, it does speak to the fact that Indigenous men are at sea in large numbers. And when we look at the actual figures, it's remarkable. So this is happening at Mohegan in 1807. Similar quotes are happening at Mashantucket in 1804. So these are the roots of disappearance. There's a direct lineage of this narrative to James Fenimore Cooper in his Last of the Mohicans narrative. This idea that Indians have disappeared. What's happening is that they're not in the, this is a snapshot in time. And what these white overseers are not recognizing is that all of the different places that Indians are existing in building lives and careers in community. So as we think about the different ways that Native people are engaging maritime labor, I want to bring you to the Customs District of New London. This is the US Customs House in New London that was built in 1833. And this really emerged, the importance of the customs districts emerged in the aftermath of the American Revolution, when the American merchant fleet was really beginning to take off, but was being devastated by the process of impressment by the British Royal Navy. And it was really upsetting American merchants. The merchants were complaining to Congress. Congress enacted in 1796 an act for the protection of American seamen. And so at every port of commerce, at every customs district, seamen's protection certificates were issued to mariners, which were essentially declarations of American citizenship. These were more or less the passports of their day. And while individual certificates were issued to mariners, a register of all of those certificates were being maintained by the customs district in alphabetical lists. And I'll share some of that with you in a moment. In addition to that, every vessel that left a port or came into a port had to surrender a crew list. So they knew where the vessel was coming, where it was going, who was on it, where they're from, and various other details. These documents are all microfilmed and recorded. They're preserved. There's copies at Mystic Seaport, but they're preserved in the National Archives. And they are incredibly rich. So I went with an inquiry about a couple of Pequot guys looking for them, and came up with something that was more astonishing than I could have ever imagined. And just to give you a sense of what that looks like, the way in which these registers were being maintained were in alphabetical lists from A to Z. And this is just a quick database screenshot to give you a sense, and I'll just take you on a quick journey through this. So starting in 1796, the date of issue, this is the Seaman's Protection Certificate number, and you can see they start very early, you know, in this list at 8, and they continue for nearly 6,000 names. And then you have the names, and there are some names that just stick out to me immediately looking at this. So if you're Mohegan, you're going to know the Ashbow name. It's a very common Mohegan name. If you're Pequot, you're going to recognize an Aaron surname. Those with African ancestry, with a sort of the legacy of enslavement, you'll see names like Titus and Caesar, and Cuff, and so on, Nero. Then we have ages, just to draw a sense of breadth here. The youngest on this list anyway is 11. The oldest is 47, somewhere in here, right here. You know, that extends on either side from, I think, 9 to 60. The height, the complexion, which becomes really interesting. If you recall, I mentioned earlier, when looking at those census records and when thinking about the social and sexual relationships of people of color and these populations coming together, this is the outcome. People of mixed ancestry are defying categorization beyond just labels of Negro or white or Indian. We start to see a constellation of race labels emerge during this time that they aren't consistent in any regard. Not the least on this particular spectrum, but even internally, I found, and let me just finish the thought, you can see Black, Indian, Negro, mulatto, Negrolitis, dark color. There are single individuals that show up in these customs records half a dozen times, not a single time with the same ascription of race. So it's deeply confusing until you have all the information in front of you. But it really opens up a window into how race is being perceived. And I should call out that for people of color, not once does the label red or brown ever show up in relationship or connection to the community of color. Other traits, kind of along the lines of those runaway advertisements, anything that's going to distinguish these people, scars, missing digits, pockmarked, anything else, and then of course, birthplace. Those surrendered crew lists also have current residents, and we can do all sorts of deeper dives on data to get at a deeper story on geographies and so on. But just to take the story forward from these numbers and across the alphabet, this is all over the place. But if we took the Seamen's Protection Certificate numbers and resorted them across the alphabet, something really interesting emerges. We can start to see groups of Indian men who go together to get their certificates, both on the same day and with sequential numbers. This whole exploration started with these two Pequot guys named Peter and Ben George, who are labeled as Indians of Groton. And there was often criticism about them not being Pequots because they're from Groton. Well, where they're at now and within the bounds of the town of Ledyard was actually Groton at that time. But they're also, if we look at other documents in the overseer's records for the state of Connecticut, they show up as quote unquote chiefs and counselors of the Pequot tribe of Indians at Groton. So we start to get a little bit more detail about who these guys are and the kinds of communities that are forming. And if we go to the yellow bar here, there are three men, Robert Fagans, Peter Hewitt, and George Keezix or Skeezix, which is a common Pequot name or Mohegan name sometimes, all labeled Indian, all from Stonington. Not one of those men ever shows up on Pequot, Eastern Pequot tribal rolls. And what I should point out too is that 90% of the men labeled Indian in these records have no tribal affiliation. So there's something entirely different going on off of the reservations that is completely off our radar in the history of our communities. And this is part of, I should take that thought a little bit further. This is part of an internal process of dispossession. As those land bases are shrinking, those reservations are shrinking, Indians are creating new rules of citizenship for themselves. So they're limiting their own population and saying, based on whether race or gender, you people you're no longer part of this community. You have to find another path. And we see that develop in the succeeding centuries. The blue bar, I'll share a couple of additional stories. Joseph West, George Pompson, Augustus Harry, all Indians from different and broader geography. Only Augustus Harry shows up in tribal records. He's Narragansett. Joseph West and George Pompson become part of other communities that are being formed off of the reservations through the purchase of private lands. And I'll share some of that story in a little bit. These other groups include a broader, not just broader geography, but a broader network that includes other people of color. And then, from this group to this group, and because we're talking about Mohegan homelands, I thought I'd add a couple of Mohegan names in here. From the Mohegan Reservation, David Jacob. I mentioned Reuben Aaron before. He's Pequot living in Preston. Isaiah Hoskett and Isaac Robinson, who I don't believe shows up on any tribal rolls. So we see again sequentially, these guys are staying connected across tribes and geographies, and this is really important. All right. So to take this a little bit further, they get on, they're going for their certificates, but where are they going? So I started an exploration of looking for these groups of men on particular vessels. This happens to be the logbook for the ship Connecticut from 1832 to 1833. I'm sorry, this is the crew list from 1832-33 for the ship Connecticut and the logbook. The logbook is in the New London County Historical Society. And like other logbooks of this type from the whale fishery, it's boom or bust. It can be so boring to read through these, but there are moments when it's explosively cool. And so on this particular voyage, I'll call these names out because you can't read them on this scale, but there is Charles Brayton right here. Oops, sorry. Charles Brayton is Pequot. Benjamin Uncas, I think you all know where he's from. Joseph Fagans, who's also Pequot, and Alicia Apes, who is connected to the Pequot community, but is raised on the Pequot reservation, but he never shows up in tribal roles. I'll follow his thread in a little bit. And what becomes really important here is not just connecting the men on this voyage, but how do we understand where they're going? Because on this crew list, it basically just says they're bound to the South Atlantic on a whaling voyage. That's pretty anonymous space until we start looking at the crew, the logbook, I should say. And what's critical here is right in this little corner, latitude and longitude. And that is our global positioning. So every day, latitude, longitude, latitude, longitude. And that brings us to Google Earth. In using Google Earth, we can begin to plot every one of those days as a point on a map. So that voyage of the ship Connecticut is this voyage right here in yellow. And they left New London. They went across the North Atlantic to the Azores, then to Cape Verde. As they cross the equator, they follow those ocean currents in a counterclockwise way down to this little tiny, well, these are the South Atlantic whaling grounds, but there's this little tiny volcanic island called Tristan da Cunha, which is this sort of whaling stopover. And so we can start to see specifically where they're going, but importantly, who else they're with, because in every one of these voyages, they're saying who else they're seeing. And they see dozens of other whaling ships out in the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean hunting whales. And they're communicating with one another. They're sharing stories, brothers and cousins and relations and friends. They're all seeing each other, not in southern New England, but across the world, not just at sea, but in ports across the world. And so this becomes really important. You can see the different voyages here that are these particular voyages that I've mapped never came into contact with one another, but you get the idea. These are the Brazil Banks, another important whaling ground. And for anybody interested in the history of Stonington down in the Falkland Islands, very important sealing region. But I want to just call your attention for a minute to, I should mention that all the orange, the yellow, and the red dots are all from the 1830s. I want to call your attention to the green dots because this is from the 1860s, 1863 voyage of the bark ship Electra. And two Pequot guys were on this. And you can see their voyage takes a somewhat different route across Cape Horn in the South Indian Ocean. I'm going to follow that around the corner to the next slide. Nope, right there. They come around New Zealand, Australia, New Zealand, past Tahiti. They do a quick stopover in Hawaii, and then they come off the coast of Alaska, Anchorage. And these two Pequot guys, Amos George and Sam Fagans, are on this vessel when they meet up with the ship Nile. And the whale ship Nile has the distinction of being the longest whaling voyage that ever took place at over 11 years. They were at sea. So they gammed, which means they sailed in consort with one another from Anchorage to the Aleutian Islands. They got into a little bit of rough weather and the Electra hit a rock and sank. Now, I have the logbook of the Electra. I think that's also at the New London County Historical Society. It survived. And the reason I know it survived is because I searched high and low for any record to do with the ship Nile. And it turns out that the only 3 months of the entire 11-year sail of that ship Nile survived. And the first entry that I found was them salvaging the wreck of the Electra. So they basically let the Electra go, grabbed all the guys, and they continued on their journey up through the Bering Straits and into the Chukchi Sea, where they were hunting the bowhead whale. They finished their journey coming back here to Honolulu. So this is the new world that Indian men are living on. And I'll just mention quickly, this is happening at the time of the Civil War, where the Confederate steamer Shenandoah is sailing around the Pacific Ocean, hunting Yankee whale ships and systematically burning them. And the Electra and the Nile barely escaped the Shenandoah several times and managed to land back in Honolulu. So I want to take you back to Alicia Apes for a moment, who I mentioned on that ship Connecticut. Only 6 years later, he was back at sea. Actually, he was a career whaler, but he was on the ship Anne Maria, also from New London. You can see him here. This is him as an older man, but he was on the ship Anne Maria. He happened to actually be a very large man. You'll see here, he was 6'1" at 24 years old. He was probably bigger than any other guy on these whale ships during the time. He's sort of this Paul Bunyan kind of character, but he bristled at the abuse of the ship's captain and his treatment of the ship's boy. The captain was very abusive and sent the boy up in dangerous conditions aloft, freezing conditions, nearly killing the boy. So Alicia Apes and the ship's carpenter mutinied off the coast of New Zealand. They took control of the ship, threatening to throw anybody who resisted them overboard. And they ended up mutually agreeing with the captain to just be put ashore at the next destination, which happened to be Otago in Dunedin, New Zealand, on the South Island. Knowing full well that if they ever went back to the States, their lives were at risk for mutiny. Alicia Apes ended up in Dunedin and never left. He married a Maori woman and had 8 children, and all of his descendants are in New Zealand today. And I have stories to share if there's time later, but it's a remarkable story. Let me see, I might have a slide or two. Yes, so this is actually his son, is a much older man, and the whaleboat that they did a lot of shore whaling from in New Zealand. And this actually happens to be Alicia Apes's older half-brother, William Apes, he was a Pequot Indian and the first American Indian autobiographer, writing his autobiography in 1829, Son of the Forest. So coming back to perspectives on what's going on in New London and just the global intersections. New London in the 19th century becomes probably one of the most diverse places on the planet. And just reflecting a little bit in this quote above from Melville's chapter on the street in Moby Dick, you can see people are from everywhere. And the same thing, New London is no different. And you can see here, as I tracked a lot of these mariners from other places, people are coming from all over the world across the 19th century. And many of them, in the way that Alicia Apes left here and never returned, they're leaving their homelands, staying and never returning, building families and communities with the broader community of color and specifically the tribal communities here in southern New England. Illustrating some of the stories is kind of interesting. I search high and low for stories of Indigenous mariners. Sometimes I have since found 2 Indigenous autobiographies in the same decade that William Apes was writing, both mariners, both on about 40 voyages each in their careers, which is extraordinary. But in order to fully illustrate this narrative, I also look for biographies of voyages that weren't written by Native people, but Native people were on these voyages. And this happens to be the ship North America that left on a whaling voyage from New London and ended up in Hawaii. And it was illustrated in a beautiful watercolor initially in the journal by Francis Allen Olmsted of New Haven fame, but also published as a book. So there's lithographs as well. And these are some of the illustrations, and probably one of the best illustrated whale hunts of all time. And there were 2 Pequot guys and 1 Mohegan guy on this voyage. And this really begins to give us deeper shape to their lives, what was happening, where they were going. And you can see just how preposterously dangerous whaling was. The rough seas, the snapping of a sperm whale's jaws on these whaleboats was incredible. But we also have the songs they were singing with a couple of shanties that show up in this journal. So we get to see how their lives were lived and the texture and dimensions of their experiences at sea with other people. If I can come back to that, I'm crisscrossing here a little bit, but I want to come back to the two Pequot guys that were on that ship Electra that sank and then picked up by the Nile. I had the opportunity to spend some time in the Hawaii State Archives a number of years ago, and I started pouring through Hawaiian records, which are being maintained by the record keepers in the Kamehameha dynasty. So remember, Hawaii in most of the 19th century was an independent sovereign nation, with the Kamehamehas leading Hawaiian royal family through much of the first half, anyway, of the 19th century. But they're very interested in maintaining records for various reasons. But if you look here, these are catalogs of discharged foreign seamen. And if you scroll down to here we have Amos George and Sam Fagans, who are now sailing on the whale ship J.D. Thompson, which was originally out of Rhode Island. So what I'm finding now, and this is in 1867, so this is 5 years after they originally landed in Hawaii. So what they're doing is living and whaling out of Hawaii for years. And the next time we see these two guys, they're living in a sailor's boarding house on the Mashantucket Pequot Reservation in the 1870 federal census, which is the first time Indians are actually enumerated on the census. I'll come back to that thought in a minute. So some other stories that connect us with the world. Another interesting story of the ship Niantic, another whaler, initially a whaler. Its final voyage left the shores of New England, ended up in San Francisco Bay. This is it here, and was transporting in 1849 miners during the gold rush. And what ended up happening was a number of former whale ships were abandoned on the shorefront of San Francisco Harbor. And you can see some of the images here where the shore began to fill in, the docks began to fill in. And here in the rotting hulk of the ship Niantic is the Niantic Hotel. And years later, of course, this waterfront continues to, these all burn down. And eventually the waterfront begins to sink and is filled in. And every once in a while, you'll capture news in the Day or in the San Francisco journals of an archaeological find when they're building a new skyscraper in San Francisco. And this is one of the hulls of the whale ships that were abandoned, as you see here and here. There are other stories of Pequots. Henry Fagans, for example, is the brother of Joseph Fagans I mentioned earlier. He was on the ship Mentor, fell overboard and drowned in the Benicia Straits of San Francisco. So there's so many stories of Native people from here that end up all over the world. Similarly, that Arctic tradition in the 1870s, there was what was known as the Lost Fleet, a premature freezing in of 32 New England whale ships were crushed in the Arctic ice. All of those men survived, but began a new era of connection to the Arctic Ocean, Arctic whaling, and New England's influence in Alaska. And again, just circling back to thinking about the way we can start telling these histories anew. I want to come back. You can't see this here, but this is Amos George. I've talked about him a couple of times. He was in Hawaii and Alaska. this is really the first time that we can begin to think about Indigenous biographies in a new way. Indian histories are often in disparate locations across communities, across broad geographies, and stored in different places. And what we knew about Amos George before, take out all the whaling records and maritime records, which are in bold. All we knew about him from his land-based records before any of this research was he was documented member of the Pequot tribe. He got married. Then he got married again. Then he was home for a year. Then he's showing up in the customs house in New London. Then he's home again for a short time. Then he's later in his life, he shows up on tribal lists and on the census. So if you're only looking at records on the land, you have no sense of who this human being is and what his significance is to the community and the tribal economies. But what we start to see on the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9 voyages he's on is that he's spending most of his life at sea. So it's actually an anomaly that he's on land. And so this really begins to tell a more fulsome picture of their lives. And this is so many people. And as I mentioned earlier, I've been tracking these other 2 autobiographies of men, and they're on 40 different voyages on 5 different continents. These are truly global citizens. And this is the case for every Indigenous mariner and mariner of color. And so I want to just shift back to the land for a moment. And I realize now that I've evaporated my time, but if I can just borrow your time for a few more minutes and hopefully give some time for questions. There are a lot of opportunities that emerge from the careers these men build at sea. And one of those is the accumulation of capital. And what we start to see is they're purchasing land. And across the 18th century and half of the 19th century, they're buying land privately. Hundreds of land transactions in New London County alone. And they're buying it in places that are adjacent to their tribal homelands, the reservations. We see this in Niantic, we see this in Eastern Pequot. And they're doing it, let me just skip through this. They're doing it in old places too, like in Patchogue up in Griswold, this Patchogue Indian community here, and in Poheganut and Groton, a much larger parcel of land near the Groton Reservoir and the Mystic Marriott, if you know that. It's the Marriott, yeah, I think it's the Marriott, by Poheganut Reservoir. So these are often Indian women, interestingly enough, purchasing the land because they're married to either enslaved or free Black men who are ineligible to own land, but they and their descendants are purchasing land privately and owning it in the English manner. And so staying connected is a way that these communities are maintaining social ties. And some of that is done by basket making and the basket making economy. Mohegans and Pequots and Narragansetts and Wampanoags are all participating in this economy as people are moving across the New England landscape, selling these resources to farmers. We see these now in lots of museum collections and in personal collections, but these basket makers are actually, when we look at their movements, they're actually moving between Pequot families, Mohegan families, other communities, and so on. And just to bring it back to issues of race, matters of race, I think I'll just end here because I do have more. But this is a Pequot man, Amasa Lawrence. This is his Civil War carte de visite. And on the back of that, that image is a label, Chief of the Pequots. And this was his role in 1864. But you can see the way he's being enumerated in different documents across these different places, state, town, federal, and so on. It's that constellation. This is all the same person. Look at what's happening. And I'll just call out, he was not just the chief of the Pequots, but he was so important to the region's Indian communities that he is listed in his grandson's obituary in Rhode Island as the Indian medicine man, from which the Narragansett tribal medicine family descends today. So I'll leave it there. And beg your forgiveness for going over and ask for questions you might have. And I'm happy to go back to any slides, but I think for now I'll just stop sharing.
Thank you, Jason, so much. I mean, I found all of that so fascinating. I could have kept listening to you all night. So thank you so much, very much for all that great information. We did have one question that I saw in the chat. And earlier in the slide presentation, I think you were showing the census maps. And there's a question asking, are these maps showing population distributions available online?
Not currently. Let me think about that. Not through my data. I don't have my data online, but they're all public documents.
Okay,
I
great.
basically aggregated lots of historical records to create this. But I think I lied, because I do have a publication called In Contempt and Oblivion that was published in the Journal of Ethnohistory in 2015. It has a lot more detail about these maps with actual numbers. So if you can, Regan, I can send you the document if anybody wants to reach out to you, just
Sure.
share away.
Yeah,
That might be the easiest way to do it. And I do want to mention, because I get this question a lot, why am I using the term Indian? You know, there are many terms for Native people. And if they're not the tribal name of those people, they're wrong. It's a historical problem. But with the term Indian, there are deep political and legal reasons why that matters. It's a word in the Constitution. It's part of federal law and part of federal recognition. So the word Indian is while it's problematic in its own right, it has deep legal significance and has a reservoir of meaning, both historically and in a contemporary way.
Thank you. Thanks for the clarification. Does anyone else have any questions or comments? I think since we're a small group, you could just always pop off the mic and ask the question.
Yeah, I was trying to type, but it's almost
That's okay.
it's so slow.
Go ahead.
I've been doing a lot of research because my ancestor was coming out of the 1700s, and a lot of things don't make sense. We've been categorized as Negro or Black, but also mulatto.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been reading a lot about, especially the King Philip's War,
Mm-hmm.
and how the Native Americans, and I mean, there's so many other tribes in Connecticut that were just destroyed, other than the ones you named.
Yeah.
And they sent some to the Virginia plantations to grow tobacco. They shipped them down to the Caribbean. They enslaved them all. That was the whole thing. That was their punishment for trying to take their land back. And they built all the stone walls in New England. As far as I can tell, a lot of them. There's millions of miles, and it was going into the 1700s. The generations, it was generation, like you from the 16, like King Philip's War was around 1675. So you're going generation to generation, but you're still enslaved. Your offspring are still enslaved. I never really understood this part about the whaling and all that. I knew, but they were getting shipped out. But that's an interesting aspect. But I'm looking at, the chain of enslavement over the years, and my particular ancestor, he got his freedom by fighting in the Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
And then we were free after that. And then we had another member come in from St. Croix after St. Croix was freed, which I have trouble tracking. He arrived in New Haven in 1820. But I was just curious about, the generational aspect of, so they were, from the Pequot War and the King Philip's War, everybody was pretty much enslaved after that, or if they actually, I think like this whaling thing, I'm wondering if they weren't enslaved to
Yeah, I
do.
think, I think to sort of touch on some of that, there's so many different experiences around power and the power dynamic. And yes, people were enslaved, people were indentured. And I think, there's been, that story has been sort of writ large in the history of New England. And while there's a lot of truth, it's not the only story that's happening. And, I think I took a very deliberate path in the scholarship that I did because I didn't want to bind myself to just a narrative of disempowerment of Native people just being steamrolled in the history of this nation. And so look for ways to understand agency. Native people are, I mentioned in those early court records I showed you with the two men going to sea and suing and one finding freedom. There are a lot of strategic ways that people in situations absent power try to find power. And let me just give you another example of where this is situated. I didn't really get to talk about it earlier, but it had to do with those notorious villains in the runaway advertisements. And that is commonly a reference to piracy. And in the first, among other things, in the first quarter of the 18th century is really the golden age of piracy. There's a real lawlessness in the Atlantic world. And who we often hear about are the white English sea captains, Black Sam Bellamy, Captain Kidd. What we don't hear about are their crews, and 50 to 60% of their crews are people of color. So we need to look at the way in which that agency is intersecting with the dispossession of indigenous people, the enslavement of African people, and the ways in which they're forging a new kind of reality kind of off of our radar. And that's never, I'm pretty sure most of you have not heard that before, but it's not insignificant. And why is it that we don't hear those stories about people of color with agency? They're taking the power back. There are routine ways in which we see this, whether it's purchasing land in the English manner, that's using the English legal system to protect and preserve land, because reservations are being overrun by encroachment, timber theft, land theft, cattle grazing, you name it. These are new strategies that Indian people are using. And there are other stories that we don't hear as well. There's huge migrations, not just out to sea, but there's a religious migration in the 18th century called Brothertown, where 7 tribes from southern New England, members of 7 tribes from southern New England, including the 2 Pequot communities, Mohegan, Tunxus, Wangunk, Montauk, Narragansett, all went to central New York to Oneida homelands, and then to Wisconsin, where the descendants are today. I don't want to belabor that point, but there are multiple, there's a constellation of stories that connect these communities and their agency. And I like to acknowledge the hardship, but I think it's also important to think about the ways in which they're navigating opportunity.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions or comments for Jason? Go ahead.
Yeah. Following up right on that, there is the example of Joseph Johnson, Mohegan. He's actually kind of like an architect founder of this Brothertown movement you mentioned now, but he before that he in between his time at Wheelock School and different missionary services, and then his own kind of personal conversion experience back at Mohegan with Samson Occam, and then like being the main runner, like kind of building that coalition to become Brothertown. In between, he had like, I forget precise, I think it was rather lengthy, multiple voyage, like a year and a half, couple years of like whaling ship work.
Yeah.
And there's a mention in his diary kind of soon afterwards of, I sat and I played my flute doesn't give any other detail, but he says, he mentions, and this is, around like 1770-ish, and he says, like, I played my flute, and it just made me wonder, and especially because you had that music example you put up, if you come across either in material objects, actual instruments, or fragments of things, or in other mentions in logs or journals, or just in any other way, if you have any other insight into sort of the possible impact of musical culture shared and learned on the
Yeah,
seas, and if and how much and whether any of that like came back.
it's a great question, and let me just start by thanking you for recalling Joseph Johnson. And I will point out that the quote of the presentation, "Preserved on the Mighty Waters," are from Joseph Johnson in his time at sea. Where he was thankfully preserved on the mighty waters, talking about reflecting at his time at sea, but also his longing for returning to Mohegan. And so to your question about musical traditions, it's, not to overuse perhaps an overused phrase, but it's kind of a motley crew in a sailor's life. There's so much going on, and traditions are so blended that it's hard to call out particular traditions and ways of connecting that. But I didn't really get to show you some of the material culture, but there are some great examples from Mohegan in the 1840s, where there's a convention. Oh boy, I see Sharon and I see Cheryl on the call, and their dear sister Faith, who's such a good friend of mine, would know this instantly, and you two might know. But there's a commemoration of a monument in Norwich in which Mohegans participated and talked about not only their skill at sea and harpooners in that capacity, but also their amazing skill and craftsmanship with whaling implements, like carved sperm whale teeth and whalebone canes and beautiful boxes of cedar and whalebone. And some of those objects are in the collections of the Tantaquidgeon Museum. And they're quite amazing. And there are collections in various other museums of some of the whalers and their object histories that were passed down across generations. So I can't speak directly to your question about music, but there was a deep skill and acknowledgement of the craftsmanship of Native people during this time, and specifically Mohegan.
I'm going to piggyback once more again. Thank you for all the different threads you touched. Later in Joseph Johnson's diary, he's like he did stays for women's corsets, and he did for like his sister Amy, and he went to so much trouble to get his lost trunk when he got back. Like, what was in there? Like, I'm convinced he had like a store of like baleen. Then he just used it and carved it for the next like decade of his life. Or he didn't even last a whole another decade. He died too young.
Yeah.
But like,
No,
I
it's
think he,
entirely
worked off of,
possible.
like, I think he accumulated material like on his whaling, just crafty,
Yeah.
shrewd dude, and like hung onto it and was just crafting it for years after. It's not just
Yeah.
basket making, but like you say, other other skills, other things. Samson Occam didn't get paid enough for his mission work with the Montauk, and he was just busy binding books, carving spoons, ladles, you name it. All that. Yeah,
Yeah.
always multitasking. And these are other, like, I don't know, is that maritime economy? He had to cross the waters to get there. The waters is the connection. Absolutely,
Yeah.
Montauk is part of this all. Yeah,
Exactly.
and part of the Brothertown move also. Yeah, yeah. Thanks.
Welcome.
Thank you. Any further questions or comments for Jason? You're welcome to just take yourselves off mute and ask away. And Jason, I did get an email requesting that article you mentioned. So
I'm
if you
trying
could
to-
send that to me, that would be great.
I was
Absolutely.
just curious with the amount of travel that apparently happened. And a lot of the tribes in Connecticut, I don't know if there's any DNA. I mean, obviously Pequot is pretty big, but I mean, there's so many of Hammonassetts and you know, Monunketuk and so many that are gone. But I mean, if around the world, I mean, these people are now around the world. So has any DNA tracking, is it possible, or can it be done, or has it been done?
I'm sure folks have explored their DNA. You know, it's particularly problematic with tribal histories. I mean, there's an element of cultural continuity that's significant. I mean, you know, it's not a pathway to tribal citizenship. You know, and I don't think you can distinguish Pequot DNA versus Narragansett DNA. There's extraordinary intermarriage and connection between these communities, and you know, we're not looking at these sort of well, I guess the idea that Indians don't move across the boundaries of their reservation. If you take a snapshot of Indian country today, it's enormously complex. People are all over the country, intermarrying and socializing, and you know, as I pointed out, it's around the world. So, I mean, there's Pequot descendants in New Zealand, there's Pequot descendants in Hawaii. You know, similarly, I found Mohegans in those places, and Narragansetts. You know, one of the guys that I'm following now was in South Africa, China, Burma, Denmark, Finland, across the Mediterranean. So, I mean, if that's just one example, imagine where in the world everybody's going.
Great, thank you. So, I mean, Julie and Jason and I can stick around for a few more minutes if anyone has any follow-up questions. But thank you all so much for joining us. We really appreciate everyone being here this evening. On behalf of the Norwich Historical Society, thank you, Jason, and also thank you, Julie, for inviting us to participate in this wonderful program. So we appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you. This is a great evening.
Thank you all so much. So we'll be here for a few more minutes if anyone has any further questions, but thank you. Julie, should we stop recording now, possibly? What do you think?
Sure.